Hello, everyone, and welcome to the launch for Ian Williams' Word Problems. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm Alana Wilcox from Coach House Books, and before I introduce our readers and our guest of honor, I'd like to just acknowledge that Coach House, where this book was produced and where I am anyway, is on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So just a little bit of housekeeping. If you want to chat with one another or with the panelists, please use the chat function. It'll default, I think, to all panelists. So if you want to make sure that everybody sees it, just to toggle the little blue bar. If you want to ask a question, which I heartily encourage you to do, then please enter that in the Q&A. And after the readings, we'll get to your questions. I'm going to introduce our readers for the evening. So first up, we will have James Lindsay, who is the author of Our Inland Sea, Double Self-Portrait, and the chapbook Ekphrasis, which has 2 exclamation marks. He is the co-founder of Plaisance Records and works at Coach House Books. He lives in Toronto. The next up, we'll have a reading from Paul Vermeersch, who is a poet, multimedia artist, creative writing professor, and literary editor. He is the author of several poetry collections, most recently Shared Universe, New and Selected Poems, 1995 to 2020. He teaches in the creative writing and publishing program at Sheridan College and is the founding editor of Buck Rider Books, an imprint of Wolsack and Wynne. He lives in Toronto. And last, but definitely not least, we have Mr. Ian Williams, author of Word Problems, and I'll read you his bio. Ian Williams is the author of 5 books. His novel, Reproduction, won the Scotiabank Giller Prize. His last poetry collection, Personals, was shortlisted for the Griffin Poetry Prize and the Robert Crouch Poetry Book Award. Not Anyone's Anything won the Danuta Glebe Literary Award for the best first collection of short fiction in Canada. And You Know Who You Are was a finalist for the Relit Poetry Award. That's a lot of awards, Ian, which are all well-deserved. I just want to say from Coach House that we're really thrilled to be publishing this book, and you're an absolute delight to work with, and I hope that all of you listening will enjoy the book and pick up a copy. So without further ado, let's get started with James. James, do you want to start reading?
Hello. Thank you, Alana. Thank you to Ian, especially for asking me to read at this. It's a real honor to be reading at your launch. Word Problems is just a stunning book, so I'm really, really happy to be here. Survivors. It would be lying to say that this cold reading will age well, or that this musician knows how to play his zither. But the performance sounds convincing, so don't stop the trot and canter for an affluent few, while their donations spiral into the wishing well, draining away like the last of the rainwater almond farmers prayed for. The droughts caused by breeding out arsenic from the most widespread milk substitute, scoffing at the modern crop. Topiary cities reverse engineered from English gardens to public housing would have been a better use than defending golf courses from encroaching deserts. 2 conclusions are clear. Either Los Angeles will return to powder or be dragged under the ocean. Time to run through the survival scenarios again. Time to start dressing as peasants again. It's suspect to trust any type of identification that isn't self-applied. So forgive the snickering. It's just hard to take this seriously after anxious nights poring over ornate impossibilities for a physically alive architecture. Floral umbilicals tethering Earth to organic space stations. Chutes producing their own oxygen. Self-repairing elevators for the survivors to ascend. And it would still be lying to declare it a solution. Best case, the scenario is the shitty wizard conjures drizzle, and the director remembers his name. All are imposters, and no one knows anyone anymore in these days of botched botany. These days of meticulously constructed personas, questionnaires for gathering information on vegetation some feel a deep spiritual empathy with, or at least what is considered spiritual when the messiahs are self-proclaimed and the survivors, decoding some scraps they were able to save, seeking meaning in endings, are strangers to each other. Harmony. There's actually, I don't know if you can hear a massive train going by my house, so I'm just gonna close the window a bit. That's better. I live directly next to the train tracks. Harmony. 9 times out of 10, the most alien organism humans can imagine is still humanoid in appearance, still wants to talk. And the thing about taking back what was said is that it's an impossible contract. 2 parties agree to understand. It all depends on their mutual will to perform forgetful. Near perfect, but born wounded, lacking technical know-how. Runts without grammar needed to know why these semi-images collage hodgepodge. Exists as affirmation. Good dog, you've done your best. Tonight you shall sleep in the big bed. But once more, you must recite the story. And this time, without prompts provided by the interrogator, who is impatiently waiting to go home to his small family. A cousin to take care of. A cat to let in. Not everyone has someone who waits for them. A collision reconstruction unit drops absorbent dust to seep up leftover liquid from the car that crashed into the bridge that bridges the dip in the road that flooded in the winter storm. An agreement between adults who fail to remember December's push, push, push to what? The right not to be alone. A contract between car and bridge, dust and liquid. Memory and reality, a molding done in crumbling Play-Doh, a stunned ring from a dumb bell left on the far side of a lazy Susan no one uses because it was never intended to be lived in as an asylum. Only a place to put our mutually unthinkable things. This will be my last poem tonight. Thank you again to Ian. It's a pleasure to read with you and my good old friend Paul Vermeersch. It's just a really fun night here. Just happy to be here. Thank you to everyone who came. Travel and leisure. There are many poems about bees failing to be bees in the liberal world because of new chemicals and sound, because of displacement and disquiet. Because office windows and karma and how sex concepts have unfastened. And because bees represent failure, the failure to protect the dependent and light sensitive from the light they never even recognized as light until it was embarrassed upon them. But not this poem. This is an earnest truther's 2-minute mini warning dolled up as awkward art, a caution sign. Look, here I stand, swarmed and stung by the little bastards. Don't listen to me. Of course everyone is still middle class. What else would we be? No, the grass is so proudly green because it was fertilized by a winter's worth of dog shit. And as long as you understand the plight is not yours forever, you may have it for now. Remember, that those who still depend on phone booths know they don't deserve gifts. They deserve to work hard and pay for things. If not us, then who is rightly entitled to brunch on the burial grounds of their economic ancestors? Come, this traveler's anxiety isn't doing the tour group any favors. Let go of the local visible world and join this vacation that can be paid for later with assumed salaries you'd be stupid not to accrue. All these years put into it, collecting stinging insects so children will have something to write poems about. Of course you should demand it all back, or force the facility to face the implication that we are who we are because of a flaw in the framework, a famous misstitch in the fiber optic thread physicists call string theory, which may or may not have anything to do with divinity, closer to a tiny typo in the manuscript that made its way to press and is what it is because of its permanence. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, James. I should mention that we do have closed captioning. If you want to turn that on, it's at the bottom bar of your screen. Next up, Paul Vermeersch.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to help launch Word Problems by Ian Williams. It's an honor. I've chosen a couple of poems that I feel engage with Ian's work in some way or another, and maybe by reading these poems, we can get our work to enter into a dialogue. One thing Ian's poems often do is take on the form of some other kind of communication. In his last collection of poetry, Personals, it was personal ads, and in the title of this book, Word Problems, evokes those mathematical problems that ask you to figure out some number problem using language. And the first poem I'm going to read is called Notes Toward a Lexicon of the Language of the Bear, which imagines what bears are talking about when they speak. In its own language, its name means, I walk slowly on hillsides and sleep with a belly full of pleasing berries, pink flesh, and brains. I dream of love vulgar and gorgeous beside the rush of rivers born of glacial ice, and I shun the times of no plenty, when all is dark and white and the blossoms do not love the red fruit into being. This is the simplest word in its language, and the first one it learns. The bear does not have a word for regret, but the nearest equivalent would be, I am not proud to have gone to the end of the world and eaten garbage there in dumps among the naked and the thin when I could not last the winter. This word is often thought but seldom spoken among the strong. And if you want to say I love you in the bearish tongue, say, you need not fear me. And translated literally, the word for solitude is, this side of the mountain is mine. Next, I'm going to read an excerpt from a longer poem called On the Reintegration of Disintegrated Texts, a Manual for Survivals. And this poem takes the form of impossible or improbable writing prompts. And occasionally it executes one of these impossible writing prompts. You have now reclaimed some of death's power and will live an extra year. Use it to record what strangers order at McDonald's. Call it order. On facing pages, transcribe the tantrums of children at a toy store against the lamentations of parents in a hospital. Call it suffer fractal. Select a novel at random. To the end of it, add the line, and then Count Anthrac, the destroyer, appeared and slayed them all. Call it They Suspected Nothing. Transcribe the dialogue from all the Sunday comic strips in one newspaper for an entire year. Do not differentiate between the strips. Call it Symposium. Filter Robert Frost's The Road Not Taken through several random languages in free translation software and then back into English. Call it Tea Has Been. Tea has been. Twice, leaving the yellow tree. I'm sorry, I cannot move. And to the passenger, long will I stay for a while, searching for where a band can keep weed after the concert, with the exception of some necessities. And it cannot be that this is grass and it's all used up. Not that this isn't exactly the same thing and the price is too. And in the morning also, and the leaves are. Oh, I kept the first day once. When you know how to do it, I'll be back, no doubt about it. I say this with a sigh, forever after. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I have traveled a little. What's the difference? And finally, I'll read this last poem. There's a line in Word Problems where Ian asks, what will happen to your profile in the afterlife, assuming, of course, you have one? And I've got a poem that addresses the question of sort of what happens to someone's social media profile after they pass on. And it's called We Are the Algorithm Made of Habits. How we will persist too soon in cyber death. In the last text, we persist in the avatar ongoing. This isn't expiry, it's sending. How I will recur in your timeline, then as now, and you will persist as pre-designed, your profile archived, transcending formats, platforms, bit rot, our numbers reassigned. We do not simply vanish from the earth, it's technical. This day, as was, is now, ever shall, resend the current. Holder of my reassigned number will dial one day, one digit imperfectly, and your phone will play its teensy bit of song and shake and glow, announcing my resurrection as vapor wraith. We are the algorithm made of habits, the souvenir of the souvenir on a loop. We will persist in this equation, in the final text. Do what you must to summon me. Hit resend again. Thank you everyone for listening, and thank you to Ian Williams for asking me to join him as we celebrate his new book.
Thank you so much, Paul. And now it is time to hear from the man of the hour, Mr. Ian Williams, author of Word Problems, which you've been hearing about. It's such a great book. And Ian, are you all set to read? Your video's not on.
I am. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Alana. Everyone's so complimentary during these during launches. I guess that's to be expected, right? But it would be nice to have a roast launch, right, where people just roast the person launching a book. Hi, everyone. Continue to blow up the chat. I'll read through the comments in a bit. I'm reading to you and coming to you from Vancouver tonight. Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Really honored to be on their land and honored to be reading with Paul and James tonight. I think they get the prize for the creepiest covers of the season. That's James's book, and Paul's. Right, there's a skull outside the window. You can't see it here, but I understand folks are zoomed out, and so I really appreciate that you are here and deciding to spend some time with us. I'm going to read one poem from Word Problems for you, and we can talk a little bit about how the book works later on. But this one poem actually spans half the book. And you'll see there's a title, and then there's a line that goes through the top pages, and it intersects all of the poems that go forward throughout the book. So we've got this intersecting poem, and so that's the poem that I would like to read to you today. It's called, It is Possible to Move On Without Moving Forward. Suppose you're a black man who is supposed to be white. Okay, you don't have to be a man. Suppose you are supposed to be white. In other words, suppose you are supposed to be a white being. Suppose being white in most spaces would be easier than being yourself. By spaces here, I mean cases, whatever. In any case, I'm taking the little space left me between the headline and the body lines. Let's go on. Let's return. Suppose you were, say, in an airport waiting on a connection, on or for your call. You don't have to be a man if you don't want to be. But you must be black. Oh, hi there. You must be black. I've heard so much about you. You're all she talks about. Enter. Username. Forgot password. No, for security purposes, it's important that you are a man. We are back where we started. Let yourself be a black man. In other words, let you represent a black man. You passed 2 women who did not offer you bonus miles for signing up for a credit card, although they offered everyone else one. Not that you wanted to be approached. You just wanted the same right to refuse. That's right. Maybe you look broke. Maybe you look tired, or naked, or hungry, or horny, or angry, or savage, or damaged, or just broke. Assuming you are a black man who has not had an interaction with white representatives, a black man who assumes he will be left alone today, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live. And so you commit to eating your scone. Is there a problem here? No, officer. Is there a reason why you're sitting here? I'm waiting for my flight. Where are you headed? Charlotte? What takes you to Charlotte? My brother? I don't see any other passengers in this area. It's quieter over here. This gate is closed. Is it? It is. Okay. Join the others. Okay. Over there. There. KK. 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 KKK. 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 KK. 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 There. There. Now. There. Come now. There. Well now. Suppose you are white. You have important problems. Not to suggest that the person you were does not have important problems, more important problems, more problems. But suppose you are white and you have an important problem. You are on the academic job market, have been for 8 years, expiring, almost have been a has been. And there's a choice job at a highly ranked Tier 1 university with a low teaching load and a cushy research budget. You killed the long list Skype interview, slayed it, and you're presently waiting on your flight to the campus visit. You are eating a scone and researching the competition in private mode. Without qualification, you are qualified. You declined a pre-approved credit card offer earlier, but you entertained the possibility that a person of color might get the job only because she is a person of color. Not to throw shade, when security spots you, sees you, and the same thing that happened to the black man you happened to be previously happened to you. Just suppose. Well, would the same thing happen to you? Please, in the space below, calculate the probability beyond probably or possibly. Show your work. The other half of the poem takes up the other half of the book. I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, Ian. I love that poem so much, and I love how it cuts across the whole book. Thank you. It's really, congratulations on the book appearing out there in the world. So maybe to start our conversation, I think we had a little poetry game in mind, a kind of found text exquisite corpse in some sort of fashion, a mashup, a poetry mashup. So if Paul and James want to come back, I'll let the three of you do that and then just segue into a conversation amongst yourselves.
All right. Sounds good. So this is a random thing that we're going to do here. Pretty much we chose parts of each other's books, lines from each other's poems, and we're going to smash them in to like one new poem and see how it works. We don't have a title for this.
Not yet, anyways.
Okay. But the audience can title this poem first. So what's the sequence?
Are we going to do me, Paul, you? Is that
Let's
good?
do it. Okay, you, Paul, me. Okay.
Okay. So I'm reading from Paul's book. The Yeti we imagine still evades us. Always look to the future. Do not be deterred. If you think you saw something, you did. If you think you know something, you do. You must become.
The onions turned black. Then a loved one unloved me online with somebody who, me. Then the neighbor's unhooked landline stitched through the wall.
What you are hearing is the first music to have been composed by an artificial intelligence. Don't feel that you have to hide your disappointment. The machine is stupid and can't be hurt by opinions. That's James. That kind of worked.
It was fun.
That's bizarre. That kind of worked.
I have a question to get us going, Ian, if that's okay. Just to kick us off here. Your book does some things form-wise that I think are just incredible. And really, everyone will just need to buy this book to fully appreciate that. But you have text that, does circles and does circles around other text and cuts right through whole stanzas right there. I was just wondering how you came to this and why you used it so much throughout the book as well.
Yeah, it's funny. So when I wrote this book, I wrote it kind of spatially, right? So I take these poems up against my wall. I was living at a different place in Vancouver at the time. And so the poems grew kind of on this plane that was not sequential. They grew just kind of spatially around me. And my goal was I wanted to write a book where no poem replicated what a previous poem was doing, right? So formally, we say this, like, let the form find the poem, the content will determine the form. But I really wanted that to be more intense, right? The way that, you don't just like duplicate children when you have multiple children. I wanted each poem to be like uniquely recognizable with its features. And so the poem started to do those kinds of unusual things just naturally once I kind of gave them permission to do that. The poem with the line crossed off, I like that line. It's just, Cashman Roger, Oliver?
Oliver, what's his name?
Russell Oliver.
Russell Oliver, right? I buy your gold. I buy your used gold. I give you cash. I'll turn your gold into cash. Oh yeah, right? That goes right across a poem called Midas about turning, the man who could turn with his touch, turn anything to gold. So who else but Russell Oliver would interrupt a poem like that with such a brazen sort of statement? So yeah, that's how it arrived there, James. Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah. But we were talking, I saw in the chat someone mentioning Paul's titles, right? And so we all have like knacks for different kinds of things. Paul, like you didn't arrange your selected poems the way that most people arrange selected poems, by the book. What was going on there?
Well, I feel like I just wanted to do something different. I wanted an opportunity to make the poem say something more thematic than just sort of highlight my development as a writer. And I think when you arrange a selected chronologically, that's what you're doing, is you're sort of showing a starting point and a finish line of sorts. Although I don't think I'm finished, but
I hope not.
Sort of that wasn't what I wanted to highlight with this book. I was more interested in sort of pulling on threads from the last sort of 20 years and seeing what those threads had to say. So I arranged it that way because I wanted to sort of figure out what I was doing for the last 25 years by looking at the major themes of my writing rather than their chronological development. And I wanted to say, when James was pointing out the circles, the sort of rondelles in a lot of the poems in Word Problems, and of course that's echoed in the cover design. It's just evidence that Ian writes circles around everybody.
I've got some friends who love a good pun. You are making them very happy right now. Right now. But I mean, like, James, you've got this thing with visuals, right? The whole like grasses section in the previous chapbook. What's with you and like visual art influencing the poems? All that they're not always like, it's not like concrete stuff you're doing, right? But there's a strong visual impulse there.
That was actually inspired by Paul, who he had two separate blogs based off art, and the last one was inviting poets to write about Turner's Sunrise with Sea Monsters. And I was in just a jam writing wise at that point, and I really liked what I did, and so I just wanted to keep doing it. And as I did them, I've always been really attached to repetition in poetry, and I really gave myself license this time around to just run with it. So the poems began to look like each other, and I even like kind of carved them out to be near identical. I think of them kind of like siblings, like they're not quite twins. They don't look that similar, but there's a lot of similarities between them. And having that visual art became like the whole book's about doubling and reproduction in different ways. And so I thought the Ekphrasis poems were just a really cool way of using a doubling technique again as well. And then I would double them again. So it's made to be sort of mesmerizing in that way. Like everything's just doubling each other, phrases are reused, titles come up. So yeah, it was Paul's blog though that just sort of kicked me off on that, and I ran with it. So if Ekphrasis poems is what I'm writing right now, then I'm going to write them.
And Ian, I have a follow-up question for you regarding visuals. Going right back to your first collection of poems, you've always incorporated a more sort of expansive idea of what it means to use an alphabet, because you frequently use icons and symbols and musical annotations and icons from computer use and signage and all kinds of things in your poems. And I know in your new book, you have a poem that uses a manicule, and I think I've got one too. So I feel like we're both interested in sort of making language visually palpable, and you do it in such an expansive way. And I wondered if you could talk about your attraction to adding these sort of things to your alphabet to make the possibilities of your writing more expansive.
Yeah, I mean, like, there are posts way out there, like Derek Beaulieu and Eric Schmaltz, who are like highly visual and stuff. But you're talking about like those kind of pop or sort of cultural references. I think all of our vocabularies and alphabets are expanding, right? Mostly through technology. And so we find these shorthand ways of communicating. And, you know, poetry has never been pure. I think oftentimes people try to protect it from the influence of that. But eventually these things cross a membrane into our work, if we're being honest. And I feel like it's a very porous membrane for me, and that stuff comes in really easily. So there's like a GIF in here. There's a skull like rotating partly through the poem. That's a Damien Hirst reference.
And you have a thumbprint.
Yeah.
And other you have musical notations.
Music. There's like, this is hard to see, right? But there's like the WhatsApp, like read and unread things in there, right? So every once in a while, these signs and omens from the outside world just kind of creep into the poem to remind you where you are, right? The poem is not in some kind of rarefied external space, but we're all sharing the same landscape together. I think it's absolutely like necessary to be real about the language that we're using, right? It doesn't have to, we don't have to stretch for this this formally poetic diction anymore. There's enough sort of new poetry in just how language is behaving these days. So
We've got some questions from the audience. The first of which is for everyone. You've been speaking about the unique aspects of your works. What about lines of similarity or continuity between the three of you as writers?
wow.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's hard to believe, Paul, that you've been writing since 1995, right? Or that, I guess it's hard to believe that 25 years have gone since,
it's a constant shock to me.
right,
But
right.
the oldest poems in my new book were written in 1995.
Mhm. Yeah, it's so interesting. Like when I was in university and reading Paul, there was the book, what was it, The Fat Kid? Very early on, right? And so I was really sort of confessional in my brain. And here was a guy who was doing things like sort of questioning what we assumed about gender, and doing it in this mode that sort of referenced like confessional candlelit, but it was so much more than that. And he was about my age or so, and I thought that was really inspiring. But it's hard to believe that's 25 years ago. I've like ingested that, Paul. Like I've just kind of come to do that myself, right?
Yeah,
What you've been doing.
That book is 18 years old as of right about now, which that's the first time I've actually uttered that thought out loud, and it's quite shocking to me to say that.
You'll be getting ready to move out of the house soon at that age.
It's a teenager.
Yeah.
And but yeah, I remember writing that book, and that book came more quickly than any of my other books. And I can't really speak to why, except there was a feeling of urgency about it when I was writing it that I haven't felt since.
Right. I feel like Jim Johnstone and I talked a lot about that book.
Yeah, I remember it was through Jim that I first met you, and would have been about that time, I think.
Yeah. And for James, you already mentioned like the interest in doubling and reproduction and all of that. That's how I feel connected to James's stuff.
I also feel like both you and Paul play with pop culture. Like you just mentioned the Russell Oliver line, and obviously Paul, in the few lines that I read from his poem, he mentions Yetis, Sasquatches. Paul loves cryptozoology, and things like that have always really, really appealed to me as not necessarily just subjects for poem, but like good metaphor fuel, you know?
Yeah, and I think the fact that the mashup poem worked so beautifully together speaks to a real continuity among your work. Next up, we have a question from Eduardo Corral, who says, Ian, I'm a poet who fears the sentence. When did you start writing prose? Was it there from the beginning, or did you make the leap after exploring the line?
Oh, congratulations to Eduardo on everything. He's one of those poets that's like something good is always happening to and with him, that you just like greet them with congratulations on your life. In terms of the sentence, I mean, as poets, we're always working with the sentence, right? And there's that tension between the sentence and the line. And so I think when I go to prose, it's because the sentence is winning temporarily. And there's more like possibility and space to work on the sentence without the interruption or the challenge of the line. And then the other times, when I'm writing with a poem, I tend to be in a little bit of a sort of like maybe a slower space or something like that. But you know, like with poetry, you can have both the sentence and the line in a way that you can't have it with prose, right? So, and then the sentence becomes so content important in prose that you just need to step away from all of that meaning stuff. So, but you don't have that problem, I think, Eduardo.
And I'll just add that not only is Ian gifted at prose and poetry, he's also now a cover model on the cover of Publishers Weekly right now.
He's got a good future of the turtleneck model in particular.
Boundless talents. Our next question is from Lauren Carter, who asks, how are you guys doing with the pandemic writing-wise? Are you finding new inspiration in all of this, or is it difficult asking for a friend? Wink.
Hi, Laura.
I haven't written anything since February. I wrote I finished writing the last thing I needed to write for the new book around the end of February, and but it hasn't been writer's block. I'm just very consciously taking a break from writing. I want to put some distance between me and what I've done for the last 25 years, and give myself permission to take time to think about what I might want to do next.
Smart. I feel like I had a huge burst at the beginning. I'm not bragging because it dried up, but I had about a month of high productivity where I don't know whether it was sort of like the uncomfortability of working from home, especially I have a son, and my wife and I were sort of figuring out how we were going to do that. But I would just write and write and write every night, and it worked and worked. But then as quick as it came, it just dried up. And I'm not upset about it. It's just much slower now, but it was a strange sort of burst at the beginning, I think, brought on by anxiety and needing some kind of output for just those. At the beginning of the pandemic, it was such strange, uncertain times. And I think poetry did, for me, really well at sort of just expressing how difficult and unknowable everything was then.
Yeah, in my case, Lauren, I switched genres, right? Sometime during the pandemic. So didn't write poetry, didn't write fiction, and I've been writing essays for the last like several months or so. And it's been good to occupy, like it's a new world, it's a new genre. It just feels appropriate to me right now to write something closer to, without the artifice or without like too much construction, closer to experience right now. That's been very, very helpful for me.
Okay, our next question is from Rebecca Rustin. Paul and Ian, you seem into conceptualism. Do you think it can be saved from the excesses of book Goldsmith et al.?
You touch that one, Paul.
Okay. I think an awful lot about technique, and I don't think very much about belonging to schools of thought. I think conceptualism is another tool in the toolbox that any writer can use to make something, express something, communicate something, and it can be a really interesting tool to use. But I don't feel that I am like capital C, like it's not on my business card, it doesn't say conceptualist poet or anything like that. But it's certainly an interesting tool to use, but so is rhyme. So is, you know, rhyme and meter are also interesting tools to use when you have occasion to use them in an interesting way. So I'll say that. And I think anytime an artist of any stripe sort of hitches their wagon to sort of an idea that they're going to base their identity on as a creative person, that they run the risk of becoming stagnant or getting into a rut. And it's probably important to give yourself some flexibility in that regard. So I won't discuss what excesses may or may not exist with the examples that you gave, but I'll say that this is my relationship to conceptualism in the way that I think about it.
Yeah, I like Paul's answer there too. I think it's still important to have those people who are excessive though, right? Those people who push concepts. Maybe the concepts are a little bit overvalued or whatever, but still that they exist and they're pushing these things right to the edge. They show us kind of what the limits are for us. So, I mean, we don't all have to like restrict our vowels and do Christian Bukinoya stuff from, 20 years ago. But I'm glad he did it. I'm glad somebody did it, right? Just not necessarily me.
Before I read the next question, I just want to note that on our Instagram, we posted some riddles in the same sort of vibe as Ian's book. And if you want to post your answer to one of the riddles in the chat, someone's gonna win something. So you might want to, don't leave us to go to Instagram, but you can put any riddle answer and we'll choose one. So just a note on that. Now we have a question from Elena. For everyone, how do you determine what you bring with you from the mundane world into the world of poetry when it's a conscious choice?
Ian, why don't you take that?
What do we bring from the mundane world? I think I bring a lot of it, but it all doesn't stay, right? Like my pockets have holes in them. So yeah, it starts off one way and then I lose a lot of the stuff. Eventually the poem sort of tightens around a kind of nucleus. So I'm not worried about bringing the wrong things in. You can always swap them in or out.
I think sometimes there's the mundane world just insists. It follows you around like a puppy, and you don't have a choice but to bring it home and feed it and watch it grow. And then if it bites the mailman, you just get rid of it.
I kind of have this thing on my phone that I saw someone else refer to as a dump doc, where it's just this like ongoing, real messy file where I just dump things in, like a phrase, an image, a quote, something I saw, just anything, a sentence. And I don't overthink it really much. I'm just like, oh, that's something for the dump doc. And although I say dump doc so much, I am overthinking it. But I just put it in there, and then I just let myself revisit it later. And as I use them, I delete them, but I just keep everything there. So there's stuff from a year or more ago. I kind of think of the way I watch my son like walk around outside. He's collecting leaves and acorns and everything like that. And then he gets like, you know, to me, it's meaningless, but he gets home and then he arranges them and he makes a nice little display out of it. And that's his poem that he just created from picking up stuff on the ground, right?
It's beautiful.
I think we can agree that if the mundane world is a dog, it's maybe a little bit mangy right now.
Yeah.
Oh, there's so many people are fretting about whether or not it's permissible to be writing about COVID or working the lockdown or the quarantine into your work. And I don't think people should be worried about that. Obviously, this is something that's affecting the entire world, and it's not invisible. So if the mangy dog of the sort of global pandemic is working its way into the house of your writing, then I don't think anyone could fault you for that. But I do see some hand-wringing sort of out there in social media and other spaces where people are wondering if it's even considered ethical or in good taste to write about these things, but I don't think it can be avoided.
So don't lock the doggy door is what you're saying.
I have to admit that I showed a friend a poem that I worked on that was new that had a COVID reference, and he said, "That's not bad." And I had this huge sigh of relief, like, "Oh God, I thought that sucks so hard." That's like, as long as it's not bad.
We have a question from Robert McGill, who asks all three of you, is there a particular poem of your own or a particular element of your work that events of this past year have caused you to see in a new light?
Wow, Bob. I feel that about reproduction, right? About the novel. Definitely different storylines emerge as time goes forward. There's a poem at the end of Word Problems. The first section here. It's one of these circular poems. It's hard to see, and it says, "I'm sure it will end, but for you, I'm not sure it will end well. I'm sure it will end, but for you, I'm not sure it will end well. I'm sure it will end, but for you, I'm not sure it will end well." You know, and I think in COVID times, that's the thing, right? How will it end?
My answer to Robert would be that I think I'm still processing that how I see things in light of COVID, because there's no end in sight, and I'm trying to get through today and make peace with sort of the fact that we're like a half a year into it already with no end in sight, that I'm not sure that I've had time to reflect terribly much on how that thought process applies to my writing, because I haven't written anything since February. I haven't had a chance to put that into action yet. And I've mostly been watching sort of my plans for a book tour and stuff like that sort of evaporate. So I've been thinking in really practical terms, like how am I going to reach an audience and how am I going to interact with the sorts of people that I used to meet at readings and launches and tours and festivals, and that none of that's happening. So how I feel about my writing in COVID times has so far been kind of about wondering how I can engage an audience rather than how I feel about my work in terms of what it means.
I think the poem I actually read tonight called Survivors, when I wrote that, I was thinking, I was kicked off by an article that another poet, Susanna Schaller, wrote about why anyone would want to survive the apocalypse. And she was talking specifically about post-apocalypse movies or TV shows like The Walking Dead or Last Man or whatever. And why would anyone want to live that? And that's what I was sort of thinking about. And even just upon reading that poem right now, I think it makes more sense to me. Not that this is the end of the world by any stretch, but it has that similar kind of global pivot to it. And that poem in particular, I feel like I don't regret writing it at all. It just rings a lot louder for me now.
I think we have time for one more question from Farhan G. When you are working on a collection, how do you know or decide that it is finished and ready for the world? If in fact you ever do.
When your deadline's up?
That's a good answer.
That's correct, James.
Yeah, because there really is no end, right? I feel like I could have just kept editing this forever. I would have driven myself insane, but I could have done it.
For me, there's kind of a tipping point when a collection of poetry is coming together. In the beginning, I don't know what the book is going to be. I'm just writing. And a poem about this, a poem about that. And at some point, I become conscious that there are threads that are tying all these things together. And it might be aesthetic, or it might be thematic, or it might be a kind of rhythm or something that is holding this new batch of poems together. And once I become conscious of that, I start more consciously trying to finish the book that I feel I began unconsciously. And so there's a clearer picture of what a completed book might look like, and I start working towards that.
Yeah, I mean,
sorry, go ahead.
Nothing too much to add there. It was a really long time between poetry collections here. I was writing poems, and I think there's a lot of poets do this. They write a bunch of poems, and they're in files all throughout your hard drive. And there comes a point where you just kind of, you're surprised by what's there and how much is there, and you pull it all to the surface. Because poems are so discrete, they just kind of exist independently for a while. And then you kind of, make families of these poems, and then the families become bigger and bigger, and then they become countries and nations, and then a whole world, and then it's pretty much done.
That's a perfect answer. We need to wrap up, but I want to thank all of you so much for your amazing readings and conversation, and thank the audience. We do have a winner for our poetry pack, Jennifer Chambers. Congratulations. And the rest of you are also winners, because if you want to order a copy of Word Problems from the Coach House website, which I think we'll post a link to right about now, that'll be 10% off if you use the code Word Problems.
All caps, no space.
Yeah, all caps, no space.
I made that code myself today.
So, just want to say, Ian, I'm so happy to put your book out in the world, and congratulations, and hooray, and yay. So thanks everyone for being here to help us celebrate. I wish we could have done so in person, but here we are. So congratulations and thank you. And does anybody need a last word?
No,
congratulations, Ian. The book is great.
Thanks, everyone.
Brilliant, Ian.
Okay. So thanks, everyone.
Have a good night.
Bye.
Good
Bye.
night,
Good
everyone.
afternoon.